Hello, my name is Oliver O'Brien, and this is my social entrepreneurship project on human trafficking. So, what is human trafficking? Well, the United Nations defines human trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. Now, this is a very complex definition. A simpler definition provided by Oxford Dictionary is the unlawful act of transporting or coercing people in order to benefit from their work or service, typically in the form of forced labor or sexual exploitation. Let's look a little bit more into this and really get a good idea of what human trafficking is. So there are three common types of human trafficking. These are sex trafficking, forced labor, and debt bondage. Sex trafficking disproportionately affects women and children, with women and children making up 80% of the people trafficked transnationally. Statistics also tell us that 1 million children are exploited by traffickers in the commercial sex trade every year. Here, individuals are used for sexual acts and encounters against their will in exchange for some form of commerce to those managing the trade. The next type of human trafficking is forced labor, which is also known as involuntary servitude. It is the largest sector of trafficking in the world. Victims may be taught a certain job or skill that they are expected to perform hours on end daily with no form of payment received. On top of this, victims are typically denied education and receive little to no nourishment and rest, only enough so that they can keep performing the tasks they've been forced to take on. The last form of trafficking is debt bondage. This is when a person is placed into forced labor in order to pay back a debt. They are given no rational option for paying back this debt, but to essentially be a slave to someone else. They are forcefully taken, and in some cases, through manipulation tactics, they can end up in an endless cycle of debt, essentially making it impossible for them to escape. They can even go on to be inherited by family members of the person who originally forced them into debt bondage. An important point to make is that an individual can still be considered trafficked, even if there was initial consent to providing labor, services, or sex acts. Essentially, if there was any form of force, fraud, or coercion, then it is considered human trafficking. So, what does human trafficking really look like? Well, human trafficking can take on many forms. Some include domestic servitude, agricultural work, manufacturing, janitorial, hotel and retail services, religious institutions, restaurants, construction, health and elder care, massage parlors, hair and nail salons, prostitution, and strip club dancing. These are the most popular examples. There's a variety of ways people can end up in a commercial human trafficking trade. Some include children being taken from adoption agencies or foster care. This can occur illegally or through the use of fraudulent credentials to adopt or through fake adoption agencies. Another example is someone thinking they are leaving their home country when promised a better job or for an organized marriage, only to find out that it was a scam. All nationalities and ethnic groups are vulnerable to human trafficking. It is a real thing all over the globe. While human trafficking is more prone to occur in places with more ports, airports, industry, and rising immigrant populations, any given country may be a source of forced labor, place of transit, or a destination for human trafficking victims. So why should we care about this problem? We should care about human trafficking because it is a human rights issue. Human trafficking is the second largest and fastest growing criminal industry in the world, second only to the drug trade. There are approximately 27 million individuals living in slavery-like conditions throughout the world. To put that in perspective, that's over 3 times the population of New York City. Of this 27 million, over 17 million are exploited in the private sector, over 6 million in forced commercial sexual exploitation, and almost 4 million in forced labor imposed by a state. Traffickers are profiting at the expense of their victims by compelling them to perform labor or engage in commercial sex. This occurs in every region of the United States and all over the world. On top of the human rights aspect of this issue, there are political and economic consequences as well. First of all, national security is breached the moment trafficked humans cross countries' borders. The estimated global profits for human trafficking is $150 billion, with 80% coming from forced labor and 20% from sex trafficking, thus meaning there's a $150 billion being made from an illegal industry. For comparison, this is more profitable than every company in the world besides one, being Saudi Aramco. Some of the companies the human trafficking industry beats out in profits include Apple, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, among every other popular company you can think of, and they beat them by a lot. With all that being said, another reason for my personal interest and passion in combating human trafficking is because of a specific realization. Just 2 years ago, this issue hit very close to home with an incident in my hometown of Davidson, North Carolina. With a population of just 15,000 people, it was surprising to see such a foreign concept hitting so close to home. I couldn't believe that such a harmful and inhumane activity was happening just miles away from my house. A place I had walked by many times before turned out to be a place where human trafficking was occurring. It changed my outlook on the world and the issues that go overlooked every day, and it made me want to do more research on the topic and understand why this issue was so heavily ignored. It really taught me that you can never be so far from something, and that human trafficking is a real thing in this world. Bouncing off the idea of human trafficking as a human rights issue, another reason we should care about this issue is because of the effects it leaves on those involved, both during and in the hopeful case after surviving this bondage. A person who has been or is being trafficked may show signs of their movement being controlled. They may have false identity documents. They may not know any of their addresses and have no access to their earnings. They're unable to negotiate their working conditions while working excessively long hours. They have limited to no social interaction and don't see their families or, for that matter, people outside of their immediate environment, and they think they are bonded by debt. All of these things are freedoms that you and I, for the most part, take for granted every day. These aspects of life go unnoticed because it is all we have ever known, and it is hard to conceptualize the idea of being stripped of these freedoms. Furthermore, upon escape, if they are lucky, survivors of human trafficking may experience profound trauma. They also may experience a lack of linguistic, social, and motor skills, and they have struggles with basic functioning. This can be struggles with eating, sleeping, moving around, communicating, among much more. Those who survive human trafficking are lucky to survive at all, but even after they have survived, it is very hard to recover from the experience they had. With human trafficking being the ignored issue that it is, I wanted to compare it with some not so ignored issues evident in society today. Because it is hard to get international statistics on certain issues, I decided to look at the more recent popular issues in American politics today. The issues I decided to compare with were COVID-19 and gun control. I wanted to compare the statistics and growth of these issues to those of human trafficking to see just how wide of a gap there really is between these issues. So if we look at human trafficking in the U.S., the Department of Health and Human Services estimates between 240 and 325,000 cases every year. University of Pennsylvania estimates between 100 and 300,000, and another source estimated 199,000 incidents. We have to keep in mind, this is not the amount of reported cases, they're just incidents or estimates, but it is still a very large problem. And comparing that with the American political issues, we see the COVID-19 death rate in 2020 was 835 people per 100,000. And gun violence in 2020 had over 19,000 murders involving guns and over 45,000 gun deaths in general. While I am not trying to compare issues that are taking the lives of individuals with an issue that doesn't, I'm simply trying to raise awareness on an issue that isn't covered as much in the mainstream media. In a sense, COVID-19 and guns are taking away the lives of Americans, but human trafficking is taking away the livelihoods of people. A question we may want to ask ourselves is, how much different is a life of slavery and submission compared to having no life at all? We fight to save lives through stricter gun control and vaccines for viruses, yet we turn the other way when an issue such as human trafficking is claiming the ability to live of many more Americans. While these statistics are available to the common public, we can see how human trafficking is a heavily overlooked issue. This is why it is important. It is essentially on a similar level as issues that are talked about much more often. As we can see, there has been growth of human trafficking in the US over the years. From 2011 to 2020, there was a 62% increase in persons referred to US attorneys for human trafficking offenses. We also saw from 2011 to 2020 an 84% increase in the number of persons prosecuted for human trafficking. And from 2011 to 2019, there was an 80% increase in the number of persons convicted of a federal human trafficking offense. So we see that human trafficking is a growing thing and it is not going anywhere. We must fight to stop it. Here are some more in-depth statistics of human trafficking. On the left, we see more international-based statistics and how human trafficking is a $32 billion industry worldwide. I mentioned earlier how it is a 150 billion profits in the industry, but the industry itself is worth 32 billion. And looking at the map below, we can see just how evident it is in all around the world. It does not just happen here in America, and it does not just happen in certain places. It is everywhere. On the right, looking at the American statistics, the top 5 risk factors for human trafficking are substance use concern, runaway youth, recent migration or relocation, unstable housing, and mental health concerns. We also see how it only takes 48 hours for a runaway youth to be approached by a trafficker, and 12 is the average age someone enters trafficking. So, children are at high risk here in America, and this thing is going on all over the world. Some more statistics continued are looking at the prosecutions and convictions from 2007 to 2014. We see a steady growth in both of these columns, but the idea is that the number of prosecutions is shockingly low for an industry that victimizes 20 to 30 million people around the world. We need to increase these numbers by much more, or else this issue will continue to grow and soon it wouldn't be able to be stopped. Here's another infographic showing the industries involved in human trafficking, which I talked about a little bit earlier. Domestic work takes up the majority of it with 38%. Restaurants and food service take up 21%. Agriculture is 14%. Beauty services and construction take up 7% apiece. Manufacturing is 3%, and the rest is 7%. So we see there's a wide array of where human trafficking occurs in our world. It may go unnoticed, but we could have seen human trafficking right in our very own eyes and did not notice. So let's recap. What do we know about human trafficking? Well, we know women and children make up 80% of the people trafficked transnationally. And human trafficking is the second largest and fastest growing criminal industry in the world. We also know there are approximately 27 million individuals living in slave-like conditions throughout the world. That's hard to fathom. 17.3 million of those are exploited in the private sector. Over 6 million are forced in forced commercial sexual exploitation and almost 4 million in forced labor imposed by a state. So even states are supporting human trafficking, which is another issue that we must combat. Human trafficking most commonly appears in domestic work, the restaurant, food service, and agriculture, but there are many more industries that it occurs in. And human trafficking numbers in the US are also larger than the death tolls of COVID-19 and gun violence. Lastly, human trafficking is a $150 billion industry with 80% coming from forced labor and 20% from sex trafficking. These are some key statistics that really give you an idea all around of what human trafficking really looks like. There's lots of money in it, there's different forms of it, and there is a lot of people in it. And if we want to stop it, then these statistics need to be spread and people need to know about this issue, because things like COVID-19 and gun violence are dominating our media, whereas this is hidden in the shadows. So the last question I really want to ask is, why does human trafficking persist in society? Well, the backbone of human trafficking is fueled by a demand for cheap labor, services, and for commercial sex. This is a high reward and low risk dynamic. This is why human trafficking is really occurring. Traffickers expect to make a lot of money with minimal fear of punishment or legal consequences. Another reason human trafficking persists is because of weak border security. The simple fact that it occurs in this high amount of people and all over the world is the fact that they cross borders with these people means we have weak border security, and we need to improve this. Well, another good thing to keep in mind is comparing this human trafficking with the drug trade. The reason human trafficking continues to go on and has occurred for so long is because while drugs are sold in one transactions, humans can be sold over and over again. So it's basically a never-ending cycle for a lot of people. The last reason human trafficking persists in society is because systemic inequalities. Mass displacement, conflict, extreme poverty, lack of access to education and job opportunities, violence, and harmful social norms like child marriage are all factors that push individuals into situations of trafficking. Families living in poverty or in situations of desperation are more likely to accept risky job offers. And when girls aren't allowed to learn, parents are more likely to sell their daughters to men for marriage. These things all contribute to human trafficking. So that is my presentation on human trafficking. Here are my references. Thank you for listening. And I hope we can take the time to really acknowledge this issue in our world today. Thank you.